record on this.
Cool. Okay, thank you for the very nice introduction of me from Anke. And my name is Boya Guo, and I'm now a doctoral candidate studying at the Harvard Graduate School of Design. And I'm interested in critical heritage studies. And for my own doctoral project, I'm particularly looking at the power interplay and conflicts between UNESCO's outstanding universal values, Chinese nationalistic discourses and practices of heritage, and the local responses in order to draw some conclusions about the underlying power dynamics of contemporary China's use of heritage and history. So today the project, I'm gonna share my screen first. Oops. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes, I can. Good.
Okay, sorry. I don't want this. Sorry, we haven't tried the, I need to look at my script, so. Anyway, I'm just gonna use this screen first, okay. So today the project I'm going to present is derived from my master's thesis that is done 4 years ago. So I look forward to your responses, criticism, comments, and also welcome any suggestions about which journal should it be submitted to, or any book publication suggestions. And here I'm also very thankful to Anke and Chris for inviting me here to give the talk at Oxford. And special thanks to David Francis, I know you're in the audience, who introduced me to this fantastic group studying studying authenticity in China. So I hope we could meet in person one day and go for a few drinks together. So the title of my talk today is Multiple Temporalities, Critical Chinese Copying as an Interrogation of the Hegemony of Modernity. You may ask, what on earth is the relationship between Chinese copying and modernity? So the hegemony of modernity is rooted in a teleological temporality for centuries, where a linear time is upheld, exhausting the possibilities of our living experience as well as our envisioning of the future. Post-colonial critics of historicism have been inviting us to provincialize Europe and its universal history, aiming to unlearn the taken for granted privileges of Eurocentric traditions and at the same time learn from the historical others. This dialectical process of learning and unlearning questions the nature of modernity and requires us to conceive different ways of acknowledge coexisting multiplicities. Space matters here because our reimaginations of it might put forward a new perspective through which we could dislocate modernity, recognize multiplicities, and drop such dichotomies such as West, non-West, modern, traditional, and innovation, imitation. But there are still challenges empirically to follow this call. For the living experience and space of the historical others are yet deeply inflected by the teleological temporality, which could be evidenced by Thames Town in Shanghai and the archaizing reconstruction of a whole city in Datong, and today's examples, Jackson Hole and Town in Beijing. So instead of labeling these stories as false, deviated, or incomplete modernity, here I want to provide a critical interrogation of stories as such to advance our reflections on the present. After recognizing these stories as symptoms of the hegemony of modernity, it is more critical to explore how the experiences of modernity are being shaped by local historical conditions and political economic relations. Historian and geographer David Lowenthal once illustrates that the past is a foreign country because they do things differently there. I want to move a step further and interrogate if the present is a foreign country as well, where different conducts of historical others could be conceptualized as coexisting spatial differences rather than temporal sequences, and where the questioning of historical time could be contextualized in multiple and dynamic spatial practices. This project explores the contemporary Chinese architectural mimicry phenomenon with its changing history and the spatial and the temporal dynamics embedded in copying from the West and copying from the past. Because Chinese copying with its rich tradition is now receiving biased judgment grounded in the dominant modern Western ideologies of authenticity and originality. This research intends to show how the Chinese copycat environments interrogate the hegemony of modern preservation theories and practices to further question the notion of modernity in its general sense. And I want to start with this quote from Edward Said. Is the beginning of a given work its real beginning? Or is there some other secret point that more authentically starts the work off? The two photographs show two real existing buildings in China. The common feature of the two buildings is that they are both composed of Chinese traditional structure and a Western canonical building. And on the left-hand side is a film studio in Shijiazhuang, which it is made up of Tiantan, Heaven Temple, part of the Tiantan, and half of it is the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. And on the right-hand side is a university building in Chengdu, in which you can see part of the White House and part of the Tiananmen is there. So behind the paradoxical architectural composition, we would ask, what happens here? And how do we read this phenomenon? One of Xu Bing's work of art, my favorite artist, entitled Cultural Animal, might best illustrate my question. In his work, a pig tattooed with invented English words reacted in a sexual manner to a mannequin tattooed with false Chinese characters. We may ask, is this dominant cosmopolitanism or globalization? What is actually the cultural relationship between the West and China nowadays through the lens of copying? And I will start from two parallel intellectual histories of how copying has been devalued in the Western and the Chinese context through time, in order to see how the Chinese notion of copying has been influenced by Western thoughts, and to prove that the originality and authenticity are both cultural constructions or invented tradition and should be examined under different cultural and historical conditions. First of all, I would love to show how the notion of copying is evolving in Western discourses. Probably the oldest view on copying is Plato's mimetic theory of art. Work of art is a copy of a form. His student Aristotle said it is natural for humans to imitate art production. Before the 18th century, copying has had a very important educational function in Western art. However, from the 18th to 19th century, under the influence of the Romantic movement, there was an emerging call for replacing an art relying on normative with an original form of expression. The word originality began to receive higher marks in the field of art production since then, for more artists believe that personal impact in the work of art was a crucial part of its quality, and originality excused an artist's irregularity of style and a lack of erudition. Other points of view include, for example, art historian Richard Schiff's said originality emerges in conscious dialogue with the discourses and practices of neoclassicism. For art historian Rosalind Krauss, this change of attitude represented a response to the decentering of origins and technologies of reproduction, such as photography. Frankfurt School philosopher, sorry, I need to move the slide. Frankfurt School philosopher Walter Benjamin also criticizes reproduction causes the withering of aura. The attitude has lasted for quite a while until postmodernists and post-structuralists such as Deleuze, Foucault, and Baudrillard seeing copy as a challenge to the privileged authorship and see authenticity and originality as a regime of power. Copying has also been a powerful cultural force in China for thousands of years. China has its own traditions and origins of copying. Back to 6th century BC, Lao Tzu, the founder of Taoism, had already investigated the notion of reproduction from a Taoist perspective. Tao gives birth to 1, 1 to 2, 2 gives birth to 3, and 3 gives birth to the 10,000 phenomena. Copying in Chinese tradition provides very different sorts of understandings in terms of the objects that have been imitated. In traditional Chinese painting and calligraphy, Gu Kaizhi, for example, he's a prominent artist in the Eastern Jin dynasty, was famous for copying magnificent paintings and calligraphies in his time. In the Tang dynasty, copying famous paintings was a large-scale activity, directed and supported by the royal court. Copying in ancient China was not only a popular and effective method to learn from the great masters, but it was also a process of learning from the past and remembering the past, and was also a way to preserve and spread masterpieces since traditional paintings were made on easily damaged rice paper. Copy a painting or calligraphy also requires virtuosity, and it is often regarded as amusement or aesthetic pleasure. Surprisingly, even those famous masters have a huge tolerance on the forgeries of their own paintings. It is recorded that when Chengdu, who is a famous painter in the Ming Dynasty, Chengdu was informed that the imitations of his works were literally being made right at his doorstep. And his answer was, if my poems and paintings, which are only small efforts to me, should prove to be of some aid to the forgers, what is there for me to grudge about? So apart from forgers, many Chinese art historians began to examine the act of copying in art productions. For example, art historian Fang Wen begins to define 4 distinct types of copies in traditional Chinese painting. The first one is mo, a trace. And the second is ling, a loose relative. And the third is fang, an adaptation. And the fourth is zao, an invention. So each category is slightly different and could be creatively used and adapted to different kinds of Chinese art creations. In ancient China, copy was seen as a creative way of making arts and was never perceived as equivalent to forgery or simple imitation. The main focus of traditional Chinese copying is never the thing itself, but is the spirituality and the symbolic significance behind it. For painting and calligraphy, the aim of copying is to capture the essence and spirit of the object. The essence and the spirit of the object are at the first sight are represented by the traces of the brush, but to delve deeper into that, the traces of the brush are actually portrayed by the gestures of the artist's hands. Therefore, the traces are no longer static and fixed. Instead, the fluid physical and mental movements of the artist can be read or imagined when his artwork is being examined, which is almost in a sense what modern artists such as Jackson Pollock's achieved in his gestural action paintings. However, the paradox is that even though the traces can be copied in every detail, the gestures of hands cannot be replicated. In that sense, the essence and spirit of the object are closely tied to the artist's mentality embedded in his or her gestures, which is very idiosyncratic. Therefore, for most painters in ancient China, copying reinforced and canonical way of thinking, and at that time aims to transcend the original through the brush's adaptive use. As a result, the copy is no longer a copy. It instead turns into a new original. So besides the copying of art on the paper, the ancient China also copied architectures. In Shi Ji, written by Sima Qian, it is recorded that every time after Qin Shi Huang, who is the king of the state of Qin, conquered one of the other 6 states, he copied the main palace of that state and rebuilt it besides his own palace in Xi'an to flaunt his power as well as Qin's important position in the country. Therefore, copying served as another function, which is displaying one's power and strength. And Chinese garden, where whether it's an impure garden or private garden, usually served as a container for copies of places of interest all over the country, or even partly from Europe, for the leisure of the rich and or for the imperial family. The celebrated private gardens in Suzhou also enjoys a high reputation of miniature universe by copying various landforms and making miniature models of architectures from elsewhere. So this picture shows you the lingering garden, Liuyuan, in Suzhou. Chengdu Mountain Resort, Chengdu 避暑山庄, designated as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1994, is a palace garden and a temple complex built in the 18th century as the emperor of Qing dynasty want to build their summer palace in Hebei province. The lake area was built by copying the landscape in the Jiangnan Watertown in the south of Yangtze River, and the mountain area copied the temples and terrains of the 5 great mountains, Wu Yue, originally scattered all over China. Besides ensuring the Han Palace as its foundational architectural style, it also includes Tibetan, Mongolian, and Uyghur architectures. So this is a painting of the Chengdu Mountain Resort, and this is the current state of Chengdu 避暑山庄. You can see the Watertown landscape feature, and the kind of Tibetan temple in the background. In a similar way, the famous Summer Palace in Beijing, though significantly ruined by the forces of the 8-Nation Alliance during the Second Opium War, was also a site that brought together numerous architectural sources. Its architects not only copied famous sites and landscapes from Jiangnan area, but it was the first palace in China that mimicked European-style architectures on a large scale. This is Haiyantang in the Xiyanglo area. And this is some ruins. You can see the kind of Roman columns here. However, as modernism made its way through the Western world, the act of copying was devalued, whereas originality and authenticity gained primary importance. As the Chinese gate began opening to the Westerners after Opium Wars, the concept of copying has changed, and the modern concepts of originality, authenticity, and heritage preservation have been introduced to China. Liang Sicheng, the leading figure in Chinese architectural field, introduced the Beaux-Arts tradition from the University of Pennsylvania to China in the 1930s. Liang put forward that, quote unquote, we have the responsibility to preserve or restore the original state of the architecture of the different periods. And in 1963, Liang proposed a principle of historic preservation to repair the old as it is, 修旧如旧, against copies or forgeries. Because of time limit, I will skip this part. It's kind of different kinds of copying and with different connotations. And this is 6 types of objects that being copied in China, in contemporary China. And here are some kind of famous examples of those contemporary copies. And even the copy is adopted as the planning scheme in Shanghai in 2001, where different counties and the districts of Shanghai adopts different styles. For example, the Songjiang New Town is in English style, and the Anting town is in German style, etc. And today I'm going to present primarily 2 cases representing 2 kinds of copying, copying from the West and copying from the past. So the first one, copy from the West, I chose a case called Jackson Hole in Beijing. And this case will be dissected through spatial and social lens. As some of you are not from the US, Jackson Hole is a resort town in the Midwest. It is famous for skiing and kind of, leisure travel. So the Jackson Hole of Beijing and the one in Wyoming indeed share a few geographical similarities. You can see they're both like backed by like mountains. And the story of this Chinese version of the mythetical American West began from a fortuitous chance. In 2003, several developers came to Beijing, hoped to make inroads into the real estate market in Beijing. At first, they wanted to build a few timber houses and sell them quickly at a very low price. Then Mr. Fan, a far-sighted businessman, joined the company and using his quote-unquote human resources from America, and he invited an American designer, Allison Smith, who was originally from Oregon, to design these houses. Allison is an interior designer, not an architect. Except for Jackson Hole in Beijing, she had no experience in designing houses. Therefore, her designs for these housings in such a desolate area were purely led by intuition. And I forgot to say, this is a middle-class community located in the suburbs of Beijing, like 2 hours drive from the Beijing city center. And here you can see this is part of the layout of the community, and what is in red circle is the kind of the entrance of the community, and what is in the green circle is called the spiritual center of the community. And even a church is erected and it's functioning very well. So here is a quote from Allison Smith, the designer of Jackson Hole. The surroundings reminded me of Montana and Wyoming, much different from China's existing seaside resorts. But I took on the challenge and drew from the local fascination with American West and the cowboy culture. We named the development Jackson Hole, and using the landscape as inspiration, I created a delightfully rustic retreat with large look comforts, colors, and charm. It was a grassroots project. Nothing like it existed before in China, but the results are fantastic and inspirational. My clients had no experience with American style architecture, so I served as teacher and guide through every step of the project. And Jackson Hole was not copied exactly from the original one, and many accommodations were made to cater to the cost, demand for sales, as well as the Chinese living style. The image on the left is the main floor plan in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, and the right one is the first floor plan in Jackson Hole, Beijing. Due to the dense population, Chinese usually love more bedrooms and more functional spaces. And Chinese people also do not fancy a big kitchen, considering it to be a waste of space. This is some information I collected from the interior designer of that community. And later I will show you some video clips of the kind of the interior of the building, as well as some landscapes of the community to let you know how fascinating it is. But here I want to say it is still a Chinese living style and a spatial planning in a Western shell. So the Jackson Hole is not only about Jackson Hole, it is a collection or pastiche of American West. Besides Teton, you could also walk into the Grand Canyon or live in the Beverly Hills or Mendocino, which seems to be living in a frontier dream. In Frederick Jackson Turner's thesis, The Significance of the Frontier in American History, the Wild West was mythologized and romanticized to create a new American identity, a form of free society, an idealistic way of living. In a similar sense, middle-class residents in Jackson Hole, Beijing also enjoy fresh air, clean water, they can cultivate plants and live a romanticized American-style life in which individualism is achieved to its highest degree. And on the transportation map to Jackson Hole, Beijing, we could see, besides the cowboy on a horseback with a gun, the highway connection from the city center to the suburban Jackson Hole is also very critical. And here we know that the main occupation of the residents living here are like lawyers, doctors, and professors who can have the privilege to, live not in the city center, and they can spend their weekends in this kind of secluded world. So with the supports of metropolitan region for sufficient job options, convenient transportation options, and abundant merchandise selections, the residents in Jackson Hole could mediate between the American frontier dream embedded in American history and the traditional Chinese utopia, which is living in a simple and idyllic and virtuous life in a secluded world. They are not interested in politics or economics, but backward looking and recall the peaceful times. More importantly, the basis of building Jackson Hole-like community must be able to attract enough educated middle to high class to buy the houses. And they're only designed for Chinese upper middle class. And the nostalgia feelings also emerge with another form of copy from the past. Here I will introduce you a resort town located also in suburban Beijing called Watertown or W Town, which has imitated the traditional Chinese folk houses in Wuzhen, south of Yangtze River. I don't have time to talk about Wuzhen itself, which is another very interesting recreated historic town. So the W Town is located on the northeastern periphery of Beijing. It is no different from Disneyland. It is designed mainly in the style of northern folk houses of Ming Dynasty, Qing Dynasty, and the Republic of China. Unlike most of the theme parks of the same kind, it was carefully themed and built with attention to detail. Unlike others, W Town in particular focuses on experiential tourism, which significantly determines its development mode, closely related to authentic experiences. The developer has made a strong effort to buy and recycle the old and used architectural materials and the building components from the villagers in order to recover the original style. And the CEO himself even drew the plan on his own. And also in his design, the traditional Chinese symbols have been recreated to add to the illusion of authenticity. And the diagram on the left shows you the booming of Chinese middle class. And China has the farthest consumption growth. So the business of W Town aiming at middle class will be very valuable, not only in at present, but also in the future. And the travel website TripAdvisor provides evaluations of W Town from tourists all over the world. I categorize them by languages. simply three kinds of languages: simplified Chinese, traditional Chinese, and English, which approximately indicates their origins to be mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau, and the Westerners. It is interesting to see that the tourists under the category of traditional Chinese have the highest evaluations of W Town. English have the lowest evaluations, and the simplified Chinese are between the two. Besides the ratings, the reviews given by tourists on TripAdvisor also show some cultural difference. Foreign visitors care more about authenticity or are more aware of it. For example, I didn't care if it was recently built, stunning Watertown, not original, but who cares? But the Chinese visitors are less bothered by authenticity and show more interest in the scenery, the management of the place, the quality of services, sense of design, and cleanliness, perhaps because Chinese tourist sites usually lack these qualities. For example, some reviews said, "This is the cleanest scenic spot I have seen in mainland China." The service staff also have wonderful attitudes towards customers. So what is critical in the marketer's strategy of creating such a theme park in W Town's case? If it is not authenticity that attracts tourists domestically and internationally, what does? Sociologist Kunz demonstrates how producers and marketers use various cultural resources to promote the appeal of their products and differentiate them from everyday mass products by authenticating them as either reflecting the other or othering, or some pre-modern traditions. We can see that it's traditionalizing. So that is the key to its success. The spectacles of W Town are both psychologically distant and emotionally close to Chinese. So it is producing a new type of mental and social zone. We can call it the familiar others for Chinese visitors. For the foreign visitors, being encircled by the distant others is an uncanny experience, which has already served as a projection of their fantasies. So copy from the past is a desire embedded in the psychological structure of tourists, the need to control imagination through recognizable illusions, and the overwhelming fantasy of architecture acting as the recognizable illusions has given way to corporatism and consumer ideology. Yet, the seemingly self-evident nationalism embedded in the domestic tourism of Asian towns hides its conflicted ideological nature. If we look at the history of the emergence of the pseudo-classic architectures in the styles of any historic dynasties in the celebration of Chinese traditional culture and classics, so-called classic spatial forms, which have been booming around the country in recent 20 years. And we could first notice that this trend is set socially and politically in combat with the foreign goods or foreign lifestyles rising after the open and reform policy since 1978. In other words, the modern Asian town tourism was deeply associated with foreignness and the subsequent consciousness of Chineseness upon its birth in the late 20th century. On the contrary to the early 21st century large-scale construction of the Western residential communities, the themed traditional Chinese towns or streets cater to the current mainstream value system of nostalgia or quote-unquote national revival promoted by Xi Jinping, the top leaders, especially after late 2013. So here I want to introduce this diagram. So the diachronic force indicated in copying from the past, as well as the synchronic, spatial and global force indicated from in the copying from the West, helped me map out the dialectics. From late 1980s, one of the continuous and productive efforts made inside the Chinese culture is that it is consciously constructing and intensifying a mirror of the enchanted West, and then continuously constructing an Oriental myth in front of the magical mirror. The mirror is both reflected and reflexive. the light of the modern West traverses through the mirror and distorts the image reflecting on the mirror. Only through this, the enchanted West mirror, could the Chinese recognize part of its unique Chineseness that has been largely lost during the prolonged political struggle and the Westernization process between 80s and 90s to 2000. To some extent, copying promotes China to become a museum of spaces and times containing multiple temporalities. This intense compression of fragments of times and spaces, as shown on the right, is in the postmodern condition becomes the new spectacle of China or the syndrome of China. In the process of pursuing modernity by copying from the Western architectures, China paradoxically slides into a form of postmodernity that is dominantly controlled by late capitalism. In Copy from the Past, postmodernity is disguised as pre-modern characters, and it is sold in the name of traditional culture in exchange of more desires for consumption. So to conclude, first in China, copies have been a powerful cultural force for thousands of years until its encounter with modern Western pejorative connotations of copying. Western world has gradually devalued copies since the 18th century, established dominant discourses, and changes the Chinese attitudes towards copying. However, authenticity and originality are cultural constructions. Second, the trends of copy from the West and copying from the past in the Chinese built environment are closely intertwined with each other. Copy from the West is about importing quote unquote progressive forms in a post-colonial context, and copy from the past is about nostalgia and a nationalistic aspiration for cultural revival. Copy from the West served as an enchanted mirror and enables Chinese to look at the Chinese history and past, and then stimulates the next step, copy from the past. So multiple temporalities have been created and thus challenge a linear historical narrative. Third, the copycat environment in China is usually located in the suburban area, and it partly caters for the American frontier dream and Chinese middle class desire for traditional Chinese utopia. Some developers also use copy as a design idea to create a lifestyle and identity for either residents or tourists. It is active creation of market serving mainly for upper middle class families. And finally, the meaning of this project is to challenge the existing dominant modern Western theories on copying, especially UNESCO's outstanding universal values, which have made a great difference to preservation practice in China today, or design practice. By copying, China offers alternative understanding of modernity, of cultural inheritance. Why bother with authenticity or originals? Thank you, and I'm wondering if I have the time to show the 10-minute video I made. Okay.
Yeah, I think that'd be great.
Okay, cool.
最近海内外很多媒体呢都刊登了一条消息，位于中国杭州市郊的天都城小镇复制法国巴黎的面貌，不仅模仿巴黎的建筑风格，而且还搭建埃菲尔铁塔以及凯旋门等地标。可是本来可以容纳10万人的城镇，现在只有2000人居住，几乎只剩下给新人拍婚纱照的功能，成为名副其实的一座鬼城。我们来看看详细报道。
One of the strangest real estate stories you may ever see. Entire cities designed to look like Paris, Venice, London, even Jacksonville, Wyoming. So why doesn't anybody want to live there?
作为一个在那里面购买了的业主的话，第一感觉就是跟他的服务，就是物业的服务是我见过最好的。第二呢，就是它那里面就是整个小区的氛围很好，它包括了这个哈斯塔特，它有一个物业周围的几条小横街，横街当中它完全都是因为是反奥地利嘛，它的那些楼盘的建筑就是我们平时没有看到过的西方建筑的特色。然后更主要的就是它的，就是给人家走进去的感觉，就是引人入胜，就感觉像去到了真正的奥地利的感觉。第三个呢，就是我觉得那边的户型，还有户型以及结构，楼盘的结构方面呢是比较合适，也两三家就是四同堂那种感觉。就是一对夫妻，然后2对老人，然后1对小孩这样子，比较合适这样的感觉，它的户型的结构。然后第4个的话，就是我觉得那里也是非常浪漫，因为怎么说呢？如果你住的楼盘又是你居家的地方，周围出去的话，就是你浪漫的那种气息跟氛围的话，那会给人家比较很不错的感觉吧。这是我觉得的一个特色。
其实呢，要说影响比较大的建筑风格呢，可能会有原因，但是呢，比如说排在第3位吧。首先呢是像他说的价格呀，使用成本啊，这是一方面；还有呢就是所处的地理位置，是一个方面；还有就是呢这个风格，你比如说就是同样价钱，同样在这个位置。比如说房子盖成那种所谓的兵营式的，一模一样，排反正可能就那条不要。就反正呢，买房这事儿呢是个挺复杂的消费过程。
其实不管是美收拾，只要是它，我觉得稍微正宗一点，就比起那些就是光有那个名字的那个，这其实也不是特别美式，就是稍微正宗一点，不像特别 low 的那种，就还行。因为你们上次去看那二基北，就是梅通燃气那个地方，它那个我也听他们说，就模仿美系的风格，就是好像防风沙还是保温什么的，所以它那个房间不会特别大，有些阁楼啊，反正拐弯啊，反正就那种布局，他们就整个是 copy 美国一个小镇上的。但是后来发现中国人好像不是特别适合那种小房子占一间，然后阁楼啊这种。所以你看我们家的房子属于比较整齐的，就是客厅是客厅，卧室一个餐厅。所以这个其实已经作为改良了，就是在这一组就这个公路南叫27南呢，已经其实改良了。所以其实也不是特别美式，就还是得符合中国人。 我觉得女性一般都是不上班的，然后基本上都是老公挣钱啊，包括我妈那朋友，就是一般都是不上班的，或者说每周只需要去1-2次单位。
我认为有点退休了，或者是没有年轻的不上班的，
就40多岁不上班，45多岁。医生、律师，我知道的医生、律师，还有高校老师好像也有。在北京的美式小学有点少，一般都是什么塞纳河一般的。莱茵河、塞纳河。
受不了，就一庄里边已经买，然后连新加坡都没看过，是那种国际。
对，那个时候叫什么Jackson Hole。
Jackson
我就觉得这个名怪怪的，好像是个地名。
是个地名。
对，但是每次我一看这个地名，我就觉得怎么在这个。
Okay, I'm gonna stop here. And I welcome your, any comments, criticism,